Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Gayla sent me a note and said, Steve, did you see about the police chief who went to prison? Police chief going to prison. I thought, that's an interesting story. I'll look into that. So from NBC News, Connecticut, former Bridgeport police chief sentenced to prison. The former Bridgeport police chief, Armando A.J. Perez, was sentenced in federal court in New York City Monday to 12 months and a day in prison for his role in a scheme to ensure he'd be hired as the city's top cop. You're curious about that 12 months and a day probably, and that's simply because the statute and the sentencing probably says that the minimum sentence is more than a year. So a year and a day is more than a year. A judge also sentenced him to 2 years of supervised release, 100 hours of community service, and fines. Now, Perez and the Bridgeport's former acting personnel director resigned back in September and pleaded guilty the following month to defrauding the city and also making false statements to the FBI. Perez had been with the Bridgeport police for almost 4 decades. He admitted to receiving confidential information about the police chief exam stolen by the other man, including the questions for the oral exam and the scoring guide for written essays. He also admitted that he had 2 officers complete his essays, passed the work off as his own, and lied to federal authorities in an effort to cover up his actions. This, again, is the man who was the police chief, but of course, he became police chief apparently after cheating on the exam to become the police chief. Some people just don't get it. I don't know. This one is really, to me, mind-boggling. After going through all that, he ended up being ranked among the top 3 candidates for the police chief's job and was appointed by the mayor, who's been close to Perez for years. The mayor served 7 years in prison for corruption during his first stint as mayor, and he has denied wrongdoing in this appointment and has not been charged. Perez had asked the judge to spare him any prison time, and the judge apparently said, no, you're going to get a year and a day. Perez's lawyer wrote in a sentencing recommendation that Perez was facing severe consequences from the scandal that do not involve prison time, including public shame, liquidation of most of his life savings to pay the $300,000 restitution, and health problems that he's got, which make him susceptible to COVID if he gets infected. And this is one of those things you often hear. And, I don't blame lawyers for making arguments because sometimes, you got to make an argument so you go with what you got. I had a law professor once who said you ride any horse going your direction. But when you're in front of a judge and trying to explain why your client should get a lesser sentence, to explain to the judge that my client's been through a lot already, it's hard to buy that argument because it's self-inflicted. He did this to himself. So he's suffered public shame. Oh, he was busted cheating on the exam to become police chief. And he feels shame? Most people are going to say he ought to. That's a given. But what he did was also a crime. So perhaps we should, do both. The state attorney general's office also has gone to court seeking to revoke Perez and the other man's city pensions under state corruption laws. The lawyer wrote, AJ is deserving of punishment for his crimes, but he's being punished already. Today, instead of living out his retirement as a pillar of his community with the distinction of being the first Hispanic chief of police of the city of Bridgeport, AJ faces his retirement years as a pariah and a litigation target. Well, again, did it to himself. And by the way, pro tip, you'll notice that he used the man's initials, not his last name at the beginning of the sentence. AJ is deserving of punishment, as opposed to saying defendant is deserving of punishment or Perez. And they do that in an attempt to make the person feel more warm and cuddly in front of the judge. Prosecutors said the sentencing of prison time was deserved. Former Chief Perez schemed to rig the search for a permanent police chief to ensure the position was awarded to him, and then he repeatedly lied to federal agents in order to conceal his conduct, the U.S. attorney wrote in a release. Today's sentence sends a strong message that public officials will be held accountable when they corruptly put their own self-interest above their duties to faithfully serve their citizens. And think of all the duties that the police want you to have. And by the way, I'm not arguing with this. But for instance, let's suppose the police come to you and say, we're investigating a crime. Can you tell us what you know? And if you lie to them, they'll get upset. And so when the FBI is investigating this and they ask this man what he knows, apparently he lied to them. Now, there are people out there who might not realize that they ought to tell the truth in a situation where they're being quizzed by a federal agent about a crime. Again, might be people who don't know that that's wrong. The man who is the police chief of a major city would know this. So I've said it before. Some people need to be held to a higher standard. One of them is simply because if this man is the police chief, he is the symbol in that community of law enforcement. And many cities have got a police chief. And many people could name the police chief in their city. Whether they could name a cop or not, hard to say, unless they know one or related to one. Chances no. But the police chief, everyone knows who the police chief is. So whenever the police chief goes outside, just simply leaves their house, everywhere they go, people look, oh, there's a police chief. The police chief becomes the personification of the police department. And so if law enforcement and law and order, and whatever you want to call it, whatever the police department should stand for in a perfect world, this guy right here, the police chief, is the face of that. And so when you find out that he got the job by receiving confidential information that was stolen, including the questions for an oral exam that gave him a leg up over his competitors, and the scoring guide for written essays. In case you're curious, when you write an essay question, you write an answer to an essay question, to score them fairly, they'll often say, well, we're going to have a scoring guide. So we ask you a question that says, tell us about this. There's going to be 5 things that must be included in the answer. And if the question's worth 20 points, they get 4 points for each one that they hit. If they hit them perfectly, they get 4 apiece. If they get it partially, they get like 3 for one, 4 for another. But there's going to be a scoring guide. And the scoring guide will show you what the answers are to the questions. So if you have the scoring guide, you should be able to ace the test. So the guy's cheating on the test. And then when the FBI asks him about it, he lies to them. So I suspect that cheating on the test is one type of a crime. Lying to the FBI is actually a different kind of crime. But again, the police chief would know this. He would know this. He's going to serve 1 year and a day in jail. I believe it's well-deserved. I think he could have gotten more than that, and I wouldn't feel bad about it. And the idea that, well, he's being punished already. That's what happens when you set your course this way. And a person who gets into law enforcement should know that they're being watched. People are watching you. People are looking at you. They're taking their cues from you, as they say. And so I get complaints. In fact, the guy wrote me an impassioned email yesterday and said, Steve, I actually often see police officers driving and texting at the same time. Cops driving along, one hand on the wheel, texting with the other hand. And no question, that's what was happening. Let's assume for a moment that that is actually true. That's no question that that is true. Okay? If that police officer saw you texting, he'd pull you over, give you a ticket for it, assuming they can in your state. And what message does it send when you're driving along and you see a police officer doing it? Now, I know people who say, Steve, I've seen cops speeding. Well, a cop might be speeding to go someplace important. You don't know. That's one I'll give them. They may be going someplace, their siren's off for whatever reason. That's a possibility. Cop driving along texting really makes you wonder. And so the police, people are watching them, and the police are supposed to be an example. If I'm supposed to be law-abiding, the police should be also. So when you find out that the chief of police got his job by cheating and then covered it up by lying to federal agents, yes, he's being shamed, and yes, he needs to go to prison. And there you go. I've had people recently tell me that I hate cops. Don't tell me that because it's not true. I also have people rip on me for being too good to cops in other videos. And, I don't know where you think my line is. I don't really care, okay? I do the videos about the topics that I think are interesting, that people enjoy hearing about. And this is one I think people need to hear about. But I don't hate cops. I actually had a guy write to me and say, Steve, I can tell by your body language that you hate cops. Dude, stop looking at my body. So here's the deal. The police chief cheated on the exam, got caught, lied to federal investigators about it, and now he's going to prison for a year and a day. Good. That's what needs to happen. So it's a crazy story. Gayla, thanks for sending it. Former Bridgeport police chief sentenced to prison from NBC News, Connecticut. As always, questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. All I ask is the chance to prove that money can't make me happy.